Ladies and gentlemen, please help me and join in welcoming to the stage Peter Reynolds.
So good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I got to be really quick because from what I understand, we are a few minutes behind. So I'm an analyst, and one of the things I just want to say about being an analyst, I attend a lot of conferences around the world. And there's something unique about this that I think this is worth Equate and KNPC celebrating. I go to a lot of cybersecurity conferences, and there's not many that have got significant IT and OT people in attendance. Oftentimes it's heavily weighted on the OT side or it's heavily weighted on the IT side, but this really means something. So what I would recommend, because I know you do put these videos on YouTube, I would celebrate what you're doing and start tweeting these messages out and putting them on LinkedIn, because I think the rest of the world can learn a lot from what you folks are doing here in Kuwait. And the first test is I'm going to make sure that the clicker works. Get the right one here. I'm going to have to point to Christy. That was my instructions. Got it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to try to be brief. I've got a 30-minute presentation that I'm going to squeeze down into 15 minutes. But I want to start off talking a little bit, something Dale mentioned that really I really thought was quite interesting. And he mentioned about winning. Because some of the data that I'm going to present as an analyst, I think we are winning. And we're winning because of the way that we're architecting and evolving our systems and the way that we're approaching our systems in terms of risk-based analysis. I want to talk a little bit about ARC's maturity model for deploying cybersecurity practices and technologies. And then I want to talk about something that is probably a little bit different. I have not heard too much about the industrial internet of things today. But the industrial Internet of Things is the thing that's going to transform your organization to become more proactive. And if you're not doing IIoT, maybe by the end of my presentation, you'll have a little bit more of awareness of exactly what it is and what the opportunities are. And you're not going to be thinking about IIoT, Industry 4.0, or any other disruptive technology until your cyber processes and practices are in order. Got it. Okay. So I'm an analyst. I actually started off my career in the oil industry. So with ARC Advisory Group, I focus on a lot of refining, oil and gas, chemical companies. So I'm their process industries analyst. Just a little bit about ARC, the company that I work for. The head office is in Boston, but they've got global outreach with offices in Canada, Middle East, Germany, Japan, China, and Argentina. So they've been established in about 1986. And I'm just going to go forward here. And this is a slide. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the clients that we work with. So Equate Petrochemical, we've been working with them for many years. So we talk about ARC's ecosystem. So we are an analyst firm, so we do a primary research of specifically these industries, and we do consulting and best practices research. So in a sense, we talk a lot, we interview, we do workshops with the owner-operators like the ones that I've got listed here, and we work with a lot of the suppliers that you can see in the bottom. So in a sense, we're in between both supplier and owner-operator, especially in the area of cybersecurity. Just a little bit of research. So when I say we're winning, there's some things that we've observed over the past decade in terms of automation systems. So the facts that I've got presented here, in 2015 we were commissioned to do a study of architectures and how companies were organizing their various systems. And it was kind of surprising when we interviewed companies and we looked at their practices. So basically what we found was 60% of the networks were being designed by somebody else. 70% of the applications were, and the applications in this industry, they call them manufacturing operations management or manufacturing execution systems. These are all at level 4 or level 5. And if you're unfamiliar with these terms, level 4 and level 5, these come from the OT side of the house, and they come from something called the Purdue model, something that's actually now baked into an ISA standard called ISA 95. So essentially what it is levels 0, 1, and 2 represent the critical control and safety functions, and 3, 4, and 5 represent the the enterprise. So what we're starting to see is as companies are investing more in cybersecurity practices, a lot of the applications and the complexity that has primarily been down at the plant is moving up to the enterprise. The other interesting thing that we noted is as new technology comes to play for protecting segmented networks, 40% of all the companies that are in process and refining in oil and gas, they all only permit one-way communication from critical control system up to the enterprise. So this is kind of important, and new technologies such as data diodes and unidirectional gateways have come to play to help companies secure their systems. Just another data point here. 60% of the companies that we interviewed, there's still only basic rules and very little governance around how they actually manage the systems. 16% of the companies actually still outsource firewall rule management to either the automation supplier or to another system integrator, and actually a staggering 60% allow remote connections to that level. So there's two things that's happening. Is one, companies are removing a lot of that complexity that would be at the plant in the form of networks and servers and focusing on the ICS and safety instrumented systems, and they're moving that to the enterprise, but they're also not investing in a lot of the practices that should be common at this layer. One of the common messages that I've heard through this conference is about IT and OT, and what I'm showing here on this slide is essentially there's a couple of different views. So most companies, when you're on the OT side, you see the drawing on your right-hand side, and it's represented by zones and conduits and networks and human-machine interfaces and DCSs, data access points. That's not how IT sees things. So the cybersecurity perspective is still about security goals and constraints, external and internal threats, and ultimately the procedures, endpoints, asset catalogs. So there's still a vast difference with many industries in terms of how they look at this technology. So the technology may not be so common after all. Another thing Dale mentioned in the last presentation I thought was kind of good. It was taking a risk-based approach to security, because like many owner-operators, you can't do everything, and you have to figure out where to apply your investments first. So this is a risk profile that we've developed by working with many different organizations, and it's basically looking at likelihood and potential impact, and ultimately trying to balance those two aspects of cybersecurity. And what we find is generally there's some categories of the different threats. There's general hackers, which would be represented by the largest group, but generally they lack technical expertise and they don't understand a lot of the different protocols that you might see with Siemens or Honeywell or Emerson or the other companies. And then there's hacktivists, and they usually have a little bit more enthusiasm, but still, these companies can't really overcome. They can overcome basic defenses, but they're not that sophisticated. Cyber criminals would be the next one, which would be the highest level of IT technical expertise, and they're capable of overcoming sophisticated defenses. And then it moves on more and more into unfriendly nations and terrorists, and then ultimately insider threats can span across all these. And we've had lots of examples of different events, and insider threats is an interesting one, because it's very difficult to quantify how often this will actually occur. And I was reading in a paper recently about cybersecurity, and there was a pulp and paper company, a process manufacturer based in North America. I think the company was called Georgia Pacific, and I can say that because that's in the news. And what had happened was an employee had left the company, and there's no processes and procedures to turn off a VPN connection. So subsequently, the disgruntled employee made continuous changes to the system, and they were able to, through systems that monitor activities and change management in the automation system, they're actually able to figure out where it was coming from and ultimately catch the cyber criminal. That person got 10 years in jail, and apparently there was millions of dollars worth of damage. So like safety and security is also very important. So this is another reason, another thing that we see often with our clients. So ultimately, companies have got a few different choices. They basically, they can either accept the risk, avoid it, transfer it, or mitigate that risk, right? But what we find is that most companies will establish some acceptable level of risk, and they'll work through different cyber means and processes to mitigate that. But often these cyber threats are ill-defined, and they're often caused by deliberate actions. This is a maturity model that we've prepared from working with many different companies, because they often come to ARC and they'll say, well, how much should I invest, or what are my peers doing? Am I behind the curve, or am I ahead of the curve? Because they don't necessarily want to spend more money on cybersecurity as compared to their peers in the industry, but they want to be right in line. So the way we've got this thing set up is we've got 5 categories, and the first one is secure, which is basic processes and manual inventories, lockdown ports, usually by the vendor, and ad hoc patch management. And then defend, which is basically, normally there's a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, which would be a separate network that would be on top of the control system. Generally there's some training for the ICS people. The contain category is focused on reducing impact of the intrusions. Usually application whitelisting zones and firewalls are deployed. And then the other category, manage, is basically all the steps to defend and contain intrusions are satisfied, including zero-day vulnerabilities, usually some type of system information and event management system is put in place to detect events. So where we find that most companies is the manage category. And we use this to help companies really make investments, because ultimately they're looking at not just reducing the likelihood, but also reducing the impact as well. I mentioned these layers 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the reason I have this is because many companies, and perhaps because Kuwait and KNPC have got such strong connection between IT and OT, your companies maybe are perhaps a little bit further ahead than some of your peers in other parts of the world. But many companies, it's still very, very segmented. IT and OT don't talk. There's little governance. There's no auditing. There's no standards. There's no sharing of any type of technology. But what tends to happen in most of the plants, the way they have been built, is EPCs, or engineering, procurement, and construction companies, build the technology. They put in the sensors, the safety systems. They do all the hazard analysis. And the rest of it is due later, okay? So IT and OT tend to be in silos. There's very little changes to the IT systems when they do a plant. So IT groups are often left to optimize and support facilities later on. So fast forward to today. I think I hit the wrong button here. Got it. Just checking to see if everybody's awake. I am. So, you know, I mentioned all of these things earlier. So we need to have good practices for endpoint management and network segmentation and zone firewalls. We need all that technology, and we need a good process to manage risk, because we think that something very different is actually ahead of us. Okay? So the Purdue model, by the way, the level 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 was designed circa 1980, okay? So that model for computer-integrated manufacturing is quite old, and many companies are starting to recognize that if they were going to build a major addition to their facility, a debottlenecking or a new plant, they may not build it according to a 1980s model. So what I'm showing you right here is something that would be part of the Industrial Internet of Things. And the Industrial Internet of Things is probably something up on the screen here. We're really testing the computer systems here today. Yeah, okay. So Industrial Internet of Things is about solving the non-process control problems that exist in your plant. And if you're like most industrial organizations, most of the things that you do tend to be reactive, and you've got little tools, and most information is in silos, and you have a PLC and a DCS, you do regulatory control, you do some optimization, and you do order to cash and procure to pay, and you do all those things, right? But the industrial Internet of Things is about not necessarily disrupting ICS and safety. It's about fixing things that have not been fixed, and that might be things like predictive analytics or predictive operations or proactive operations. Those are all common things that we see today. So unlike the Purdue model, this represents a digital platform for something like analytics. The interesting thing about these things is they're designed a little bit like, if I can use the word outside in, whereas the Purdue model systems or the ISA 95 systems are designed inside out. You work your way up and you eventually do your enterprise integration. More integration if you're in the chemicals and less integration if you're in refining. But in this case, they're designed by an outcome, a challenge that's being solved, whether it's supply chain and logistics or whether it's predictive maintenance, detecting pump failures, detecting incidents in your refinery or facility. It starts with designing the outcome and the solution and then working your way down. So unlike the stack of safety systems and sensors, you actually start with something called a gateway. And this gateway is not necessarily a switch. A gateway is an appliance like you may have on an airplane, for example. So just to give you an example of a modern digital platform, the next time you take a flight, that is a connected Internet of Things asset that has a real-time control system on that engine, and it has some gateway or several gateways for data ingestion to send that information up through a secure process to some cloud and some IoT outcome. So the reason I'm bringing this up, because if you were going to spend any capital on your facilities today, you're not going to design it the old way, you're going to design it this way, and this way requires a new approach to security. So, just a little bit about standards, because I think there's something important here. If you look at that same stack, if you could take the automation level 1, 2, 3 at the bottom and the enterprise 4 and 5, one of the things that's been dividing us on the IT or the technology side is actually we speak different languages, and it's not just a matter of confidentiality, integrity, availability. It's not just that. It's the standards are completely different. So if you look at automation, they tend to follow ISA 62443 family of standards, NERC CIP for the nuclear industry, NIST SP 800. So there's a lot of standards, but when it comes to standards on the IT side, there's the ISACA standards, or like COBIT or ITIL for managing these systems, or the ISO standards for 27001. So I want to talk about something that's actually required for transformation or some of these new systems. SAP, Schneider, GE, Intel and Bosch, IBM, plus say 300 other members have actually started something called the Industrial Internet Consortium. Maybe just a quick show of hands. Who has heard of the Industrial Internet Consortium? Excellent. Okay, right. So the goal of the Industrial Internet Consortium is, one, to develop frameworks for you to build the plant of your future, but also to build a security framework that encompasses a lot of the things that the existing standards and practices have not done. So things like standards like 62443, items like privacy are never discussed, right? So there are gaps in each of the standards. This is an example of the framework, and the way the IIC discusses this is they talk about trustworthiness, and they've defined different elements of the standard, and I certainly don't have time to go into all the standard, but my hope is that after this session, you will look to the IIC, what they're doing, download the standards, they're free, and get familiar with what they're doing and what the various vendors are doing that are developing solutions in this space. But essentially, security is one aspect of trustworthiness, and this is the condition of the system being protected from unintended or unauthorized access, change, or destruction. Safety is the condition of the system operating without causing unacceptable risk of physical injury or damage, right? Reliability is the ability of the system or component to perform its required functions. Resiliency is like the bouncing back, or the emergent property of a system that behaves in a manner to avoid, absorb, or manage dynamic conditions. Privacy, of course, many of you on the IT side, you know this, it's the right of an individual or group to control or influence what has been related, right? So these things are all very important for the standard, and what you'll notice is that on the IT side, resilience has not ever been part of the integration of reliability, security, and privacy, and safety didn't exist. So this concept of HAZOP and environmental release or tolerable deaths and things that they talk about in plant that didn't exist on the IT side, but just same on the operational side, things like data privacy didn't exist because from the OT side, their main thinking was that the data would never leave the plant. Just a little bit here about endpoint protection. The way that the things work now, these outcomes that I talked about for the industrial Internet of Things, they need sensors. They need real-time data to be able to operate. So if you're going to predict maintenance or predict, in the case of an airline company, if you're going to predict fuel consumption and route optimization and predict failures of that engine, you may not want to connect the jet engine control system to the internet, but you may connect a gateway and manage the security accordingly. So what the IIC security framework has got provisions to manage gateways, which could be dropped into your refinery or your chemical plant or your wastewater treatment facility, and it's managed through the life cycle of not just the supplier of the technology, it could be the OEM or the machine builder, and also the owner-operator. So this is for managing security functions. This is how we see things. So why IIC? Why not just stick with the standards that we have? It's like, well, we think at ARC, the standards need to be modernized to incorporate new outcomes and new ways to deliver benefits. So we think it requires a cross-functional team of IT and OT and engineering technology, ET, but we see that the benefits in things like connecting your machines so that when they break down, they phone the suppliers in advance, the parts are on order. We see this in terms of connecting operations and being able to predict the next incident in your facility because it's got access to all this data, and not just the data that's in your real-time systems and your process historian, the data, all of the history, the data that's in the logs, the data that's in the various operational systems that are separate today. And we see connected workers because most people that go to work in facilities today, they all have smartphones and they all need their information. So these types of things are really transforming benefits for a lot of these companies. And so really, how do you capitalize on this? Well, we think that the most important things is that cybersecurity strategy workshops should be front and center for your companies. In the case if you've got highly segmented IT and OT organizations, organizational design workshops are a good place to start. And ultimately, understanding about what your peers are doing and peer research is a good place. And if you want to follow me, because I'm an analyst and I write a lot and I talk to a lot of different companies, there's also another 80 analysts that also work for ARC. So if you look at some of the sites, one of our sites is called industrialiot.com. You can go and follow get the newsletters, or you can also see us on Twitter. So I think I've done a pretty good job of keeping under my time limit. Maybe there's a time for one question? No questions. So I'm here for 2 days, so please come and see me.